The ambush and the unveiling of the trap. The broadcast began with a deceptive calm. The cameras rolled. The red, on AIR, sign glowed like a warning light. And millions of viewers settled in, anticipating a predictable clash. Live. Vice President Vance versus Senator Schumer. Immigration showdown. The CNN headline blared across the lower third of the screen. This wasn't merely a segment, it was a high-stakes convergence of political careers, public perception, and legacy, destined to be analyzed for years. The setting, a brightly lit studio, was engineered for controlled, civil policy discussion, yet, everyone present, from the producer gripping his headset to the lighting technicians, felt the crackle of something volatile in the air. This was not a policy debate. It was a collision of worlds. J.D. Vance, the populist conservative intellectual, and Chuck Schumer, the entrenched master of Washington procedure and narrative control. The moderator had barely finished the standard preamble before Senator Schumer executed his planned attack. Leaning forward with a rehearsed, almost condescending smile, "Vice President Vance," he began, his voice steady, "your administration continues to push what you call the Big Beautiful Bill, a rebrand of Trump's immigration agenda. But let's be clear, it's an economic and moral disaster." Schumer paused, letting the statement hang, confident he had already won the emotional argument. "The numbers don't lie. Families are suffering in your so-called policies." But Schumer never finished his sentence. The interruption wasn't a shout or a flinch, it was a quiet, precise declaration that immediately shifted the balance of power. Vance looked across the table, his expression unreadable, and said in a tone that sliced through the studio's expectant silence, "Senator, I brought the numbers, and tonight, I'm going to show America what they really mean." That moment froze the debate, turning a structured political performance into a sudden, unscripted confrontation. Viewers at home felt the shift, the subtle but profound change from sparring to something genuinely dangerous and real. Schumer blinked, his trademark political confidence wavering for a crucial half-second before his muscle memory kicked in. "I welcome the facts, Vice President," he responded, trying to inject a mocking tone. "But please spare us the theatrics." And that was the cue for Vance to deploy his strategic weapon. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a single sheet of paper, held it up, and turned it directly toward the camera. "These are the figures from your own committee's report. Senator, you signed off on them." The control room erupted in panicked whispers. The producer, recognizing the catastrophic breach of script, motioned wildly to cut to commercial, but it was too late. Vance, maintaining a surgical calm, leaned slightly into his microphone. "For months, you've accused our administration of inflating projections. But this data, your data, confirms what we've been saying all along, that the bill would have created more jobs. Not fewer. It would have reduced illegal crossings by 30% and increased funding for border technology by 50%. So, I'll ask you, who's misleading the American people?" Schumer, a man whose entire career was built on controlling the data, exhaled sharply, a sound of political recalculation. "Those numbers lack context," he replied, his voice strained and rising. "You're cherry-picking metrics to justify an agenda that hurts working families." Vance interrupted him, still quiet, still in control. "No, Senator, I'm giving context. You're giving excuses." The silence that followed was heavy, electric, and alive. It was the rare stillness that only live television can hold, the moment a carefully constructed facade collapses. America wasn't just watching a debate, they were witnessing a reckoning. In that silence, the country sensed the truth fighting its way to the surface. And that, Vance knew, was the only thing that mattered. The unmasking of context. For a strained moment, the studio air was unnaturally still. The kind of absolute silence where the faint hum of the cameras feels like a roar. Chuck Schumer adjusted his glasses, forcing a brittle smile that failed to reach his eyes, the visible signal of a veteran politician realizing he'd walked into a meticulously planned ambush. This was no longer a predictable sparring match over talking points, it was an exposure. J.D. Vance maintained his position, the picture of control, his posture suggesting a man who was there not to participate in the performance but to deliver a verdict. He was letting the evidence, the cold, hard numbers, do the heavy, Undeniable lifting. The moderator, trapped between two political titans, attempted to restore the facade of civility. Gentlemen, let's. Vance cut him off with a quiet finality. His gaze fixed on Schumer. Senator, he said evenly, you've spoken about compassion, about protecting American families. I agree with that sentiment. But compassion without accountability isn't leadership. It's theater. The line was devastating. Schumer's forced smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. Accountability, he repeated, his voice tight with controlled anger. You mean your administration's obsession with self-promotion? You're not governing, you're grandstanding. Vance nodded slowly, acknowledging the deflection with an almost philosophical detachment. If telling the truth on national television is grandstanding, then maybe we need more of it. Across the nation, millions of viewers felt the intensity, reaching for their phones, hashtags forming instantly as the internet sensed the scent of political blood. The debate had transcended policy and entered the realm of character. The moderator cleared his throat, desperately trying to pivot. Let's pivot to economic impact. No, Vance interjected, quietly but firmly, his control absolute. Let's not pivot. Let's finish this. He placed the single sheet of paper flat on the desk, pressing down on it with his palm, anchoring the conversation to the unassailable truth of the document. Senator, do you deny that these figures come directly from your subcommittee's fiscal report dated June 12? Schumer hesitated, a crucial pause that spoke volumes. Those figures, he began, attempting to sound authoritative, were preliminary and lack final context. The updated version was never released. Vance cut in, his voice rising just enough to carry the indictment. And you know why? Because the updated numbers proved us right. Schumer's tone hardened, adopting the familiar attack of a cornered insider. Vice President Vance, your selective reading of confidential data borders on manipulation. You're presenting half-truths. Half-truths? Vance leaned forward, his voice calm, yet razor-sharp. Then tell America the other half. The words were not shouted, they landed like a heavy, precise hammer blow. It was raw precision, the kind that makes silence louder than any noise. Schumer opened his mouth, but no sound came, his eyes darting toward the camera, toward an audience he could no longer control with scripted talking points. In the control room, a producer issued the crucial, defining instruction: don't cut. Whatever happens, stay live. In that electric moment, America wasn't watching the usual political spectacle. They were watching the unmasking of power in real time. The stark reality that the figures a politician uses to attack his opponent were often the same figures he desperately buried to protect his own agenda. This was the moment the old master of Senate debate truly realized he'd lost control of the narrative. A loss that would prove irreversible. Empathy versus accountability. The moment of silence stretched, fragile and heavy, marking the point of no return. The stillness was that of a man, Chuck Schumer, realizing the meticulously constructed floor beneath his feet was not merely shifting, but dissolving entirely. Decorum had already fled the room. J.D. Vance looked down at the damning sheet of paper, folded it neatly, and set it aside, signifying a move beyond mere data points to the profound moral cost of Schumer's political maneuvering. Senator, Vance continued, his voice dropping slightly, now carrying the weight of personal stories. You've spent years telling Americans that compassion means open borders, that security means cruelty, that enforcing the law somehow makes us villains. But I've met the people behind those numbers. And they're not statistics. Schumer, scrambling to regain the moral high ground, shifted in his chair. And what people are those? Mr. Vice President? The ones you forgot, Vance answered, each subsequent sentence a calculated, devastating strike. The mother in Ohio who lost her son to fentanyl because a border that should have been secured became a negotiation tactic. The farmer in Texas who watched his land turn into a corridor for crime because funding got tied up in your committees. The single father in Pennsylvania who can't get work because jobs go to shadow markets you refuse to regulate. This was a masterful strategic pivot. Vance wasn't arguing policy, he was arguing consequence. He had effectively weaponized the human cost of legislative stagnation, forcing Schumer to defend policy failure against personal tragedy. The moderator and the crew stood frozen. This was no longer a debate. It was an impromptu tribunal of conscience. Schumer's voice dropped to a defensive growl. You're exploiting tragedy for political gain. Those stories are convenient, cherry-picked to support a narrative of fear. He attempted to retreat to the sanctuary of process. We govern a nation of laws, not emotions. Vance seized on the hypocrisy. And yet, it's the emotions you rely on when you campaign. You invoke tears when it's convenient, outrage when it sells, and compassion when it pulls well. But leadership isn't about playing feelings like instruments, Senator. It's about facing hard truths. Then, in a move of unexpected strategic generosity, Vance offered a moment of quiet recognition. I know you care about this country, Chuck. I don't doubt that, but somewhere along the way, you started believing that good intentions were enough. They're not. Intentions don't feed families. They don't secure borders. They don't bring back sons. The silence returned, more profound than before. Schumer, visibly shaken, clasped his hands tightly on the table, offering a glimpse of the private burden he carried. You don't know what it's like to carry this burden, to make decisions that break you inside. Vance delivered the ultimate, unanswerable question, not as an accusation, but as a devastating revelation. Then why hide the truth from the people carrying it with you? The question landed like a thunderclap, pivoting the debate from a contest of facts to a profound crisis of conscience. Schumer's expression hardened again, but his voice faltered at the edges. The momentum had shifted irreversibly. The old master of debate was completely exposed, unable to produce a single, genuine political defense. The counter-punch and momentum shift. Cornered and exposed, Chuck Schumer had to fight back, not with evidence, but with the visceral skill of a political veteran whose survival depended on seizing back the emotional narrative. He inhaled slowly, gathering the energy of decades spent in the legislative trenches, and leaned forward into the camera's unforgiving light. You're good, Mr. Vice President, he conceded, a tone of grudging respect laced with malice. You know how to perform sincerity. You know how to wrap talking points in tragedy. But I've been in this game long enough to recognize political theater when I see it. Vance remained still, watching, almost studying his opponent's technique. Schumer pressed the attack. You think facts are your armor. But facts without empathy are just weapons. And you, sir, have mastered the art of wielding them to wound. The shift was immediate and palpable. Schumer was attempting to redefine the moral frame, portraying Vance not as a truth-teller but as a ruthless opportunist. He then pivoted to the counter-narrative, his voice regaining its familiar, commanding rhythm. You conveniently forget the asylum seeker who fled violence with nothing but hope. The child who crossed that border because staying meant death. You want to talk about compassion with conditions. But compassion without courage isn't compassion at all. It's cowardice dressed as policy. A ripple of support resurfaced online. The old Schumer, the passionate champion of the left, had momentarily risen from the canvas. I've watched your administration weaponize patriotism, turn decency into division, Schumer accused, leaning closer, his face dominating the camera frame. You talk about protecting families. But what about the ones torn apart by your deportations? You talk about jobs. But what about the businesses that depend on the very immigrants you vilify? Let's not pretend this is about the truth. It's about power. You're not trying to save America. You're trying to own it. The moderator hesitated, sensing the danger, but the producer's instruction remained. Keep it rolling. Vance finally spoke, his tone even quieter than before, cutting through Schumer's fiery rhetoric. Are you finished, Senator? Schumer, breathing unevenly, concluded his fiery defense, believing he had successfully returned the blow. But Vance didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded, almost respectfully. You're right about one thing, Senator. Fear does sell, but I'm not the one selling it. The quiet response landed like a deep, unseen echo. Schumer's counterattack, though passionate, had ironically served to drain the energy from his own argument. The audience wasn't focused on who was louder. They were focused on who sounded real. Vance's control and composure redefined the moment. You call this performance, Senator? Maybe, Vance continued, his voice steady. But if telling the truth on live television is performance, I'll take the standing ovation. The old master of Senate debate, for the first time in years, had no immediate retort. The moderator, sensing the critical moment, broke the tension. We're taking a quick break. But for millions of viewers, the break was illusory. The revelation in real time was far from over. The final evidence and the breaking point. The break provided no reprieve. The air in the studio remained thick with unresolved confrontation. As the cameras blinked back to life, J.D. Vance immediately moved to complete the indictment, denying Schumer the chance to re-establish control. Senator Schumer, before we move on, I'd like to finish what we started. Vance reached for a folder that had been sitting unopened. A new, damning prop. You spoke about families torn apart by deportation. I agree. Every broken family is a tragedy. But you never mentioned the families broken by the system you helped design, the loopholes, the stalled funding, the selective enforcement that leaves communities exposed. He opened the folder and slid a single page across the table. Do you recognize this? Schumer glanced at it with visible contempt. Another prop? No, Vance stated, his voice steel. It's a report authored by your office dated August 2022. It details how funds allocated for border technology were diverted to unrelated pet projects, your projects, solar grants, public murals, urban initiatives, all fine causes, but not what taxpayers were told. The revelation was a critical blow, transitioning the debate from a matter of principle, empathy, to a matter of political corruption, budgetary malfeasance. Schumer's defense instantly devolved from moral high ground to procedural evasion. Those reallocations were approved through bipartisan oversight. You know that. Yes, Vance replied, his tone sharp. But you didn't disclose them until 2 fiscal cycles later. Transparency isn't something you do when convenient, Senator. It's something you do when it's hard. Schumer picked up the paper, scanning the highlighted lines, a flicker of genuine discomfort in his eyes captured by the relentless camera zoom. I won't let you turn this into a spectacle, Schumer insisted, his voice hardening, though his composure was visibly cracking. You're distorting facts for headlines. Then clarify them right now on air. Vance challenged, leaning back, his calm and overwhelming strategic advantage. Schumer, with a visible effort to regain control, straightened his tie. Let's be clear. The funds were redirected to address climate and infrastructure concerns, issues that matter to millions of Americans. And yes, perhaps communication could have been better. But don't stand there and act like you invented accountability. Vance's response was a faint, almost pitying smile. Accountability doesn't need to be invented, Senator. It just needs to be practiced. That quiet statement was the breaking point. A wave of murmurs swept the studio, the sound of the audience exhaling a collective, profound realization. Schumer's voice rose desperately. You think you can come in here with your righteous tone and condescension and rewrite the last 4 years of governance? You have no idea what it means to hold the weight of policy. The compromise, the sleepless nights. I do, Vance interrupted quietly, his voice carrying the final, devastating weight of the truth. I just stopped using them as excuses. The silence was final and absolute, the breaking of a political career. Schumer stared at him, unable to produce a single, viable defense. The damage was done, the performance was over, and the truth, for the first time in a long time, was left standing alone. The mirror and the mournful truth. The emotional atmosphere had grown heavy, thick with the weight of political mortality. Chuck Schumer's initial fire was replaced by a quiet, defensive weariness. He was no longer fighting to win the debate, but to salvage a fraction of his dignity. You came here for a soundbite, Schumer said, his voice low, almost mournful. That's all this is. You don't care about the system. You care about spectacle, and you found the perfect villain to build it around. Vance's reply was the moment that would define the entire confrontation. A line instantly etched into political history. You're not my villain, Senator. You're a mirror. Schumer looked up, genuinely startled. It wasn't an insult, it was a profound, damning implication. Vance continued, his tone not accusatory but philosophical. A surgeon explaining the nature of the disease. The truth is, I used to believe the system worked. That if good people just played by the rules, told the truth, and trusted the process, the right things would happen. But somewhere along the way, the process became the prize. And men like you learned to master it. Not to fix it, but to survive it. Schumer's fingers tightened against the desk. You think idealism is a strategy? That you can just bulldoze decades of governance because it doesn't fit your narrative of purity? No, Vance said softly. I think purity was lost when governance became a performance. The exchange transcended policy, it was a deep, in-depth analysis of the institutional rot that plagues Washington. Vance, the outsider, was diagnosing the sickness of the insider. You've spent your life in public service and I respect that. But somewhere you stopped serving the public and started serving the institution. You started defending process over people. Schumer, deeply wounded, offered a final, desperate defense. You talk like you've never compromised. Like your side hasn't played politics with people's lives. 2. Vance acknowledged the truth of the system with brutal honesty. You're right, we have. Every administration has. But that's the difference between us tonight. Senator, I'm not here to defend a record. I'm here to break a pattern. Schumer looked down at the desk for a long, quiet moment. Defeated. You think you're the first one to try? Every generation believes it can purify politics. They all end up buried by it. Vance's reply was an almost defiant whisper. And let it bury me. At least I'll know what side of the truth I was standing on. The camera finally cut. The red, on AIR, light went dark. The silence in the studio deepened. A profound exhaustion settling over both men. This wasn't a mere victory for Vance, it was an exposure for the entire political ecosystem. America had not simply watched a debate, they had seen the curtain pulled back. Witnessing the human cost of political survival. The truth had finally landed. And its cost, for the master of the Senate, had been paid in full. The aftermath and the inevitable storm. The immediate aftermath of the broadcast was not a burst of applause but a profound, frozen silence. The red light was out. But the reckoning had just begun. In the control room, monitors glowed, replaying the viral lines. You're not my villain. You're a mirror. And empathy without accountability isn't leadership. These weren't sound bites, they were sparks igniting a national wildfire. The impact was instantaneous and deeply personal. In Ohio, the mother Vance had mentioned, Marlene, watched her own story elevated by the vice president, finally feeling seen by a figure of power. In Brooklyn, an old friend of Schumer's from decades past turned off his television and whispered. Heartbroken, he used to sound like that. 2. The truth had pierced the political veneer and struck individual consciences. By morning, Washington was vibrating with a dangerous energy. Schumer's war room was grim. His communications director, Dana Ortiz, watched the looping clips, the exhaustion in the senator's eyes no longer masked by studio makeup. He outprepared you, she stated bluntly, cutting through his claim of an ambush. Schumer, however, was thinking not of press releases, but of the faces he'd betrayed, the letters he'd read and conveniently forgotten in the service of institutional survival. Across town, Vance's team was celebrating, drowning in media requests. His press secretary read the glowing headlines, Vance exposes the establishment. Yet Vance remained unmoved. Numbers change. Integrity doesn't, he stated, refusing to capitalize with a celebratory press conference. No message. Let them argue. Truth doesn't need a press release. His caution was strategic. He had not sought to control the narrative, but to unleash the truth. And now the truth was taking on a life of its own. By afternoon, the political system was reacting violently. Unconfirmed reports began to circulate, leaks about financial audits, missing allocations, and internal Senate emails detailing concerns about budget manipulation in the very projects Vance had cited. No one knew the source of the leaks, but they accelerated the chaos, fueled by disillusioned staffers or opponents seizing the moment. The Justice Department reportedly received anonymous tips. Senate aides were subpoenaed. The rhetoric escalated from historic to seismic and devastating. Schumer's allies frantically called for unity, while his opponents demanded immediate hearings. Younger senators whispered that Vance had achieved the impossible. He'd made truth fashionable again, breaking a pattern of decades-long political evasion. That evening, Schumer sat alone in his office, the muted TV replaying his defeated face in painful HD clarity. He realized, with crushing finality, that the truth he had fought so long to control had finally stopped belonging to him. Across the city, Vance stood on the Capitol steps, the wind tugging at his jacket. His advisor confirmed the critical update. The Senate Ethics Committee wanted him to testify, not as a target, but as a witness for context testimony. The system, forced to acknowledge the evidence, was moving. Vance knew this was no victory lap. It was the beginning of the storm. The debate was over, but the full, inevitable reckoning had begun.